Welcome back to the CivilNet podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Elliott. I'm joined today by returning guest in front of the show, political commentator, Eric Hacopian. Eric, thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
So we're here actually because we want to unpack the major reshuffling that took place yesterday. So it came to a shock to a lot of people, but essentially 6 ministers were replaced. So you now have 6 ministries in the government that have been entirely headless. Why we have so many ministries is another question for me to figure out. But yes, tell us, what do we know so far about what happened?
It's hard to know because there's very little information outside of the perfunctory thank yous. Thank you for serving, and both sides. It doesn't seem to be ill will in the short run. So there's not the drama that we've seen with other people leaving. Generally, when people get dismissed in Armenia as one of 5 things, first one is incompetence. The second one is differences in specific policy areas or directions.
Like lack of party loyalty.
Yeah. Third one is being compromised internally. You're willing. It's a very small place, so you're willing to act or not against, especially when it comes to prosecutorial bodies. The fourth is being compromised externally, i.e., you're too close to a foreign power, and in this case, it always ends up always being Russia.
Yep.
And the last one is if you're too ambitious, which was the case, I believe, with Mr. Hacopian a couple of months ago. So those are the 5 things that usually, most of them really don't apply here. I think the key ones here are the ones in the judiciary and corruption, because what we've seen is a pattern of charges that have been filed for the last 4 or 5 years since the revolution against former regime officials on corruption matters, and most of them have gotten nowhere. Yeah, I mean, they've confiscated some stolen property. So
for context, there's approximately it's upward of $1.5 billion in asset forfeiture cases, but they're pending. In other words, they have to go through the court system, which is a bit of a circus for the last few years.
So, and there's been speculation that some of these cases have actually been spiked by the bureaucracy for them to have been designed to fail.
Well, Kocharyan was famous for doing that, right? He'll show up, or he'll make excuses to not come to court. He's sick. He's this, and it just dragged on.
Well, that's
for
on
years.
The defendant's side, but there's been speculation that on the prosecutorial side they were compromised in the sense that they were pursuing cases in a matter knowing that they will fail, which is a speculation out there. Almost anywhere in the world, proving these corruption cases is not easy, because there's always ways to hide it. But they have, for the most part, categorically failed in going after anything that's big or systematically going after corruption. And that is seen as a great failure of this government. And so I think he was just cleaning house. Someone has to take the blame. And in this case, it's the lower end. It's never going to be the prime minister that takes the blame.
Well, for context, I mean, these 6 ministries, they're not, some of them are a little less consequential, but most of them are not inconsequential, right? You have the Interior Minister, you have the Justice Ministry, you have the Ministry of Emergency Situations. There's 3 other ones that are, one of them is the prosecution, like the anti-corruption prosecution. But ultimately, I mean, some of them, it's unclear on where they're going to end up, and this is another thing that that's kind of opaque in Armenia, whereas the process for a minister to either resign or be dismissed usually looks the same. So they have to submit a resignation, and it has to be approved by the prime minister. So who initiated it, we don't really know, right? So you'll have all these cases of, oh, well, that person was fired, and then we know them here, personally at the studio, and we know they weren't fired. We know that they quit, but they had to go through that process. So we can't really quantify or qualify how many of these people are gone for those reasons, but what we can speculate is, for example, the Interior Minister, this was the Prime Minister on last week, right? He famously almost shouted, right? He berated him, saying that, my patience is running to an end here. So he was famously incompetent. Right?
No, we have that. I think what you really look at here is you have to look at the politics of this. First of all, when 6 people are gone on the same day, they're all fired. 6 people don't quit in the same day. And I think this is one of the first acts heading towards the elections a year and a half from now. Because obviously, if there's, he doesn't want to go into the next elections 7 or 8 years after taking power while they have not been able to move any of these cases along. So it shows he wants to come in with new people. He wants to have new energy. This is essentially I see this as the first act heading towards the campaign that we're likely to have in the spring of 26, which is not that far away in real terms.
Yeah. Well, he's the prime minister who lost Artsakh, right? So he wants to be known for something other than that, and it looks like he's kind of lining up his ducks. It's interesting to look at. One that did surprise me a bit is Gner Sanosyan, who was the minister of infrastructure and territory, and he actually did a really good job when the Tavush flooding happened. Like the emergency response was frankly, for Armenia, was actually really impressive. And this was right after, they were already stretched to the limit when they took in 110,000 refugees. But they were really quick. They were on the scene. They were answering questions to journalists, which was quite unprecedented in Armenia. They were actually surprisingly well organized. I was quite pleasantly. I was impressed, honestly. So I'm surprised they're shuffling him around, or he's been fired. Or...
I'm not sure. I don't think he's the one we've seen the end of him. I think there's going to be another round someplace else. His ministry, I think they shined in times like this, but I think their mandate, frankly, is much wider than people think. He deals with mining and other matters which are national security issues, which I think might be above his practical pay grade. But overall, yes, there are instances of competence that you see in our state sector, and that happened to be one of them.
Yeah, I mean, the prime minister has a habit of doing that as well, right? Which is shuffling people into positions for a period of time so they can do their work, and once they've outgrown the position, or the position has outgrown them, right? Like the current defense minister had former Minister Sanosyan's position previously.
No.
Right? He reformed that ministry, and then he moved on to the defense ministry, and he's reforming that. Arad Mirzoyan, right, is now the foreign minister. So he does seem to have a habit of doing that. But what do you think this means politically when you have all six of these guys who, this began with, again, this public outburst of the prime minister? Is this show, do you think, or is he seriously upset?
I'm sure he's upset, but that show and not show and practicalities are the same in politics. I think there are particular glaring areas of failure in this government, in this history, reforming the judiciary, going after corruption, actually prosecuting corruption cases. They've actually done a lot to get rid of institutional corruption. Yeah. So I think I think he's just shoring up his political weaknesses, internal political weaknesses. We know he has substantial external political weaknesses when it comes to foreign policy and defense. So I think this is a defensive move to, blame in politics flows downward. If these people are incompetent, well, who chose them? To be in their positions. So it's like in the sports, the owners never get fired. It's the coaches that get fired. We have an element of that here, but this is very political. Okay.
I mean, the only hope at this point, right, is that they're going to be replaced by better and more competent people. I mean, the rumor has it that, for example, this is obviously a bit personal for me, right? Because we just did that podcast last week on the police and roadside accidents and so on. The situation is bad. So to remove Vaher Azarian is very good. And the rumor has it that it's going to be his deputy who's going to be replacing him. First of all, she's a woman, which is excellent, Mrs. Sarkisian. And on top of that, apparently she's quite competent. And she's young and she's not Soviet. And so making space for younger people is a good thing, right? So we can only hope that that's what we're going to get across the board.
If you're going to bet on more competence in Armenia, you bet on younger and female.
Yeah. One thing that I forgot to mention actually is that the one person that they did, one of those six that was fired is the deputy of the NSS, Mr. Kairamyan. Yeah. Forgive me. But what do you think that's about? He's the deputy of our intelligence services.
Well, as you know, NSS is an institution in transition. It was always the place had the greatest level of Russian influence outside of the MOD. So I wouldn't be surprised if this has to do something with that. But I have nothing to go on, so I don't want to speculate and put a tag on the person that I do not know.
To be fair, these guys' job is to go after these corrupt people and arrest them, the oligarchs and so on. And as you said, we haven't seen any of that, so they're very likely sitting and waiting on these cases, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about Trump. Before we talk about his appointees, one thing that's really interesting. Donald Trump has had a phone conversation with Prime Minister Pashinyan. Can you unpack this for us? What's the significance of this?
Well, it has significance, so we shouldn't overplay its significance. So go through the pattern of who he's talked to. He's pretty much talked to, I would say, the top 10 important countries in the world, the leaders of the top 10 important countries in the world, plus one or two in the news, i.e. Israel and Ukraine. There's no comparison of a country of Armenia's size, relevance, over whose leaders had a conversation with Donald Trump. I think this is a good sign because it shows that this is likely the work of our ambassador in D.C., so she deserves credit for that, but also the outreach that's been done in Donald Trump's base, especially among Christian religious activists and others. So Armenia has become a much bigger, is a bigger issue than it was during the first Trump administration.
We're on the radar now.
We're on the radar, so which is a very good sign. But we shouldn't exaggerate this. This is simply a perfunctory phone call, and he's eventually going to get around to talking to everyone. But it's interesting that he has yet to have this conversation. As far as we know, he definitely has not had this conversation with Ilham Aliyev because he would be all over the news in their side. And as far as we know, he hasn't even spoken to Erdogan, who's a quote-unquote NATO ally and obviously a far more important
and friend, apparently.
Yes.
Friend.
So I think there's this is a good sign. It's a good sign, but we shouldn't exaggerate its relevance.
Okay, well, this actually leads us to the next topic, which is we're starting to get an idea now of what Trump's team is going to look like. And you do have quite a few people who at least have been formerly pro-Armenian. Actually, his special envoy to the region, I forget his name, but he was actually in Armenia. He's a Christian fundamentalist guy, but he's very pro-Armenian. And then you've got Marco Rubio, who's famously anti-Turkey and very pro-minority Christians. You have Tulsi Gabbard, who's banned from Azerbaijan because she's been to Karabakh. She's very pro-Armenian. She's going to be head of intelligence. And there's Vivek Ramaswamy, who, of course, who's going to be in the famous Doge Department of Government Efficiency with our friend Elon Musk, who sent his greetings for WCIT just a couple of weeks ago. So you got an interesting cocktail of characters, but you do seem to have some pretty pro-Armenian people. The question is, of course, what kind of sway or pull they're going to have in the administration.
I think we need to ignore the quote-unquote pro-Armenian statements of any of these people. I don't think that really means anything. It means if any of them, most of them have been on paper, especially the ones who are legislators, being pro-Armenian or on the side of Armenia or an advocate of Armenian causes. But that only tells us that they are not going to be against us. That means that they're inclined, positively inclined. What it matters is not the statements they made as senators, because that the moment you come to power on an executive position, you have institutional memory and you have institutional approaches to things. So we shouldn't exaggerate any of those things. What matters is continuing the institutional relationship, both on the political, on the diplomatic, and on the military side. And the good news is, most of these people, especially when it comes to Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Waltz, and Tulsi is a bit of an outlier because she's more of a idol breaker than the other two. She's not an institutional person. They're far more. They're likely to be a continuation of current U.S. policy in the sense, the parts of the policy that are not don't change with presidents. And that is deepening U.S. Diplomatic involvement here, growing the alliance between Armenia and the West, the U.S. specifically, and most importantly, deepening defense relationships. That matters for us. One key caveat here that stands out is almost all of these people are obsessively anti-China. They're anti-China and they're anti-Iran, but frankly, I think they're even more anti-China than they are anti-Iran. And what happened last year, the greatest juxtaposition is us being a signed strategic partner in the United States, while 2 weeks later, Ilham Aliyev makes himself the signed strategic partner of China. Yeah. This is something that we cannot repeat enough when it comes to talking to the West. So far, so good. I think the key thing for Armenia is to continue the institutional relationships that frankly don't matter with the coming and going of presidents. And the key people, and for Armenia, state is the most important, followed by national security. These are all institutionalists. So what we were looking for, institutionalists and not idol breakers. And then the one idol breaker that's there is Tulsi, which is actually quite favorable.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to remember, right? Is that the machinations of the state, it's almost like a state within a state. A lot of that stuff on the ground doesn't really change at the stroke of a pen, right? Yeah. So it's not so much if they're pro-Armenian, but as long as they're not anti-Armenian, because it means they're not going to hit the brakes on these programs that have gained a momentum of their own, right? Let's talk a little bit about COP29. I mean, it's I don't know if you saw, but yesterday the Turks actually blocked the flight of the Israeli Prime Minister to Baku. The president. Yeah, I didn't even know it was still going on. This thing, frankly, I mean, it's been just a resounding PR nightmare. I mean, there's nothing we could have done. Like we just had to kind of let him give Aliyev the rope to hang himself with, but it's been a spectacular PR nightmare. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I don't know if you saw yesterday, you had 2 sitting U.S. senators,
congressman in the U.S.
Congressman, pardon me, yeah, who they were straight up just said, you know, like we're supporting Armenia.
Okay, no, you're talking. There's a press conference with Sheldon Whitehouse and Markey. Those are the 2 senators, and then there's a press conference in D.C. with Congressman Pallone and Markey.
Yeah, so, Pallone is different.
Yeah. So what you're referring to is actually the 2 senators when they said they're pro-Armenia.
In Baku.
Yeah.
Which I haven't seen anything that badass since the Lithuanian foreign minister in Baku started lecturing Hikmet Hajiyev about the Armenian genocide. Their faces just kind of dropped, right? But what is your overall assessment of? I don't know when it ends. I don't know what's going on, but
it's another week, I think.
What's your take on it so far?
It's been a spectacular disaster for him, and it's been a spectacular success for anyone who's against that regime and what they do. This was supposed to be his. People forget, you know, we're so inundated with our own region and our own issues. This is the biggest event that's ever happened in Azerbaijan. Most of the world has no idea anything about this region or that country or its leader. So for most of the world, the first impression was not the wars, was not the ethnic cleansing. The first impression of the world is actually COP29 and things that he said. And in public relations, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So this was Ilham Aliyev's and Azerbaijan's coming out party. And what's going to come out of it is one phrase, which is carbon, oil, and gas are God's gift. You know, when he finally dies in exile and he's buried in Moscow someplace, that's what's going to be on his gravestone. So that we could have never imagined this to be this spectacularly good for our side, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's every so often I catch myself wondering if maybe we've gotten Aliyev all wrong and he actually is this very brilliant chess master, and then he goes and does stuff like that.
Well, no, I think you raised it. Well, actually he is. There's a contradiction here. Yes, he is. He is. But what all people like him, all authoritarian figures, they don't do well in places where they are not in complete control, where if you do not control the narrative, you don't even build state capacity to be able to do that. No, he's exceptionally smart. I mean, he's essentially gotten away with the highest, you know, the highest crime in international law for no repercussions. So, no, he's exceptionally smart. But what people like him do not understand is how free systems or how things work in a real world in which not everyone is going to say you're right all the time.
Yeah, is he exceptionally smart, or is it more just a reflection of the failure of, first of all, the lack of leadership in the free world, right? We don't have any actual strong leaders. We don't have people who genuinely believe in the post-World War II liberal order enough to stand up for it. Like, we don't have any Ronald Reagans or Margaret Thatchers anymore. We don't have people who are genuinely, I know you're not a fan, but that's why I'm poking at you. But, okay, I'm sorry. We don't have any, God, who's that Marxist that I can't stand? Your favorite. We don't have any Chomskys anymore. He's half dead anyway. No, but, you know, you have a failure of the global system. A really good example is Charles Michel from the EU went over to shake his hand as, like, that same day Aliyev is ranting about France and the Netherlands, and you had Borrell in the EU saying, hey, we actually stand with France. And like, these guys are spineless. Right? And it's also our own stupidity. He won because of our own stupidity.
Of course.
We had the lowest common denominator. This is not some brilliant... This is not like the Emirati leadership type of authoritarians who have, you know, leveraged their wealth to create something.
No,
you know.
I mean, you look at how smoothly the Emiratis got away with COP28.
Of course.
I mean, they didn't... If you look at his speech, he was frustrated, he was angry, he was lashing out. Yep. So no, you have to understand the strengths, competencies, and the incompetencies of a authoritarian system. And yes, obviously, losing to a guy like that is more our fault than anything else.
Of course, it's a sign of our own incompetence, and there's a lot of room for improvement. Hopefully, we're bridging that gap, and you know, one step at a time. Eric, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks again for watching CivilNet.